Good morning, everybody. My name is Amit. I lead FinOps at Citi. And today we're going to talk about focus. And when I first mentioned that to my friends, they thought it was some wellness retreat where we talk about focusing on things in life. But this is slightly different. What we're really talking about here is FinOps itself, right? It's a data problem, traditionally. There's a lot of CSPs out there, cloud service providers. They offer us a lot of data all the time, sometimes per second, sometimes per hour, sometimes per day. And oftentimes, we are overwhelmed by it. And we're overwhelmed because there might be data that is different per provider, right? You might have AWS gives you curve files, GCP will give you BigQuery exports, so on and so forth. And trying to consolidate all this data together becomes very difficult because at the end of the day, you have different columns, you have different values. You know, resource ID in AWS might be something else in GCP. And so what Focus really tries to solve for is that problem, right? You try to resolve an issue where the same language can be spoken when you think about cost data. And last year, around this time, Focus was debuted. And this year it went public, 1.0. And even more important, all 4 cloud providers now natively support Focus. So if you're starting off from scratch and you want to get your cost data, you don't have to write converters that take your curve file or your BigQuery export and then translate it. You can grab it natively already, right? And as of today, all 4 major cloud providers are supporting it. And that's great. And then the question becomes then, what's next, right? Are we done? Should we just get on a boat and party, have a sign that says mission accomplished, and then be stuck? Well, not quite, right? Because now we get into the heart of what do we do with the practitioner side of things, right? So as a FinOps practitioner, we always consider these industry things are really important, but how do we implement it on our side? And the reality is it's difficult, right? A lot of us already have a system that is being used to grab the data from these CSPs, and then we already have our own internal domain that works pretty well, right? We have BI tools that use that domain knowledge. We have some pre-canned reports we offer. We have some sort of querying capabilities. So the question really becomes, what is it for, you know, as a mature FinOps practice, why would we rip out what's already working and replace it with something like Focus, right? And so that's what I want to really talk about here. And so here is an example of one of the Focus specifications that we have, right? This is build cost. It explains in the specification the name, what the display name should look like, a good description, and also constraints, right? When you think about cost, it shouldn't have a dollar sign in front of it. It shouldn't be a string. It should be a decimal with a specific metric, right? And it should not allow nulls. Now, looking at this and then thinking about our own internal data set, the question I had was, how do I implement this internally at Citi? And there was 2 things we could do, right? One was we could rip out the existing system we have for extracting the data in our ETL and replacing with Focus converters. But I think that's really missing something which could be much better, right? And what we're talking about is effectively using Focus to really transform our FinOps practice into a data science discipline. And to do that, what we're considering doing is replacing our internal domain that we have for CSP data and SaaS data for cost and using a Focus compliant version itself, right? And the benefit there is numerous, right? Because oftentimes what happens is we expose our data via some BI tool that we may have, Tableau, or a third-party tool that we may be using. But once in a while, an engineer will ask you, can I just get the raw data? Can I just look at it myself and analyze it and figure it out? And the hesitancy always is, our internal data is, it's our baby because it's been added on. The column name sometimes might be, ARN-URL because you and someone couldn't agree on the name. So you decided to just combine it together, right? You may have amount for cost, but then you also have cost because that's the thing that you're actually charging back for. But then you also have something called build cost minus allocations because, again, no one's ever going to see this data. It's fine. It just powers a BI tool. And so when you do expose this data to somebody, you run the risk of having somebody use the wrong values to do their analysis, or oftentimes the data is not clean, right? You may have an environment column, and that environment column seems pretty straightforward. You have production, non-production. But then you also may have production UAT, because while it's in production, it's using prod parallel UAT data or something, right? And so often these small things that we're describing happened because at the time it was good enough because it didn't really matter, right? You could just have your data, powers a BI tool, it's okay. But I think now we're getting to the point where, in FinOps, we always talk about shifting left, right? Getting the access to the data at a point where you can make decisions on it. So you go to reInvent or another conference and you see some really cool tool. You come back, you want to do a POC with it, and not just for the viability of replacing an existing system, but also at what cost, right? Infinite scale in cloud often means infinite cost too. And so to be able to get this data in the hands of the people who can now use it to make better decisions is very important. And rather than relying on, again, a pre-canned report or a BI tool, it'd be really nice to offer a data set that's fully thought through, right? Has these descriptions instead of, emailing me back and forth of, yeah, that column isn't really what you think it is. If you're focus compliant with your data set, you don't have to worry about these things, right? You can literally just show any developer, expose this data, and they can start using it today and doing their own analysis as well. So the question becomes, how do you actually do it, right? Because the reality is very few people here probably have their data in a way that can just support ripping things out. Again, it's working, right? It's not perfect, but it works. And so what I've thought about is, how do we actually do this in a way that isn't a lot of, I don't want to use the word effort, but isn't ripping something out, taking 5 months to replace it, and then the business case is, well, it's doing exactly what it's doing before. And so what I found is basically, how do you combine these two things together is not as hard as it looks, right? Focus itself may have 43 columns that are published. And then you have your own data set, right? You have your own columns like sector, business unit, that gives you metadata about that account or resource that isn't part of the focus column. So what do? You could reach out to the focus committee and say, hey, in 1.1, please add my columns that I really care about. But I don't think you really have to do that, right? So the thing that I realized is that while in the focus format, there might be very specific things that say, you must have this column, you must not have blah. That's really important for the CSP providers to implement. But for you to be focus compliant, you don't really have to do all 43 columns or none. You can take an iterative approach. You can look at the columns that you need, right? For example, you may not need resource ID because everything is ephemeral, right? You spin up Kubernetes containers and spin them down many times a day, and so you don't really need resource ID. Or you don't have a start time, end time, you have a date because you do 24-hour billing, and that's okay, right? You can look for the columns that really matter to you, already have in your data set, and convert them over to be focus compliant. Because once you do, for example, go from daily billing to hourly billing, it isn't a big change. Your 24-hour window for start and end time just becomes smaller, right? Your cloud cost amounts that are billed cost versus amount are now standardized. So as an engineer, you're not explaining to somebody that, yeah, that one has a dollar sign in front of it, the other one doesn't. You're already compliant, so when you do start adding other columns as you need them, the spec still holds true there. So, in FinOps, we often talk about crawl, walk, run approach. And I think focus can benefit from the same exact iterations, right? It's okay not to have all 43. And then for, the columns that we have, which are business specific, like the BU or sector, I think the focus framework, what a lot of people miss, it's not just for the 43 columns. It also explains how to name things, how to have values for them. An example is you have categories versus types. A category is really like an enum, right? You have production, non-prod, UAT, whereas a type should be a string. So if you have, for example, I don't know, like an ARN or a GUID or something in there, well, that should really be a type there. And even though it may not sound as useful to you today, as an end user, just having that consistency across the data, both the column names and the values, goes a really long way. So then you're less focused on, no pun intended, of making dashboards yet again for someone else. And you can say, this is the data, here's the specification, and here's how to use it. And then you also get the benefit of using the Focus Foundation's use case library, which kind of has very interesting SQL queries you can run against your own data set to extract information today. So to get started, if you scan the QR code, you can get information about Focus itself. Like I mentioned, all 4 major cloud providers are already supporting it natively. You can start extracting. And even if you're not in FinOps, maybe this is the time you nudge the guy who is in FinOps and say, hey, have you heard about Focus? Can you translate our data set over so I can start using it today? And that's all. Thank you.